March 22, 1943, Majdanek concentration camp occupied Poland. Snow still clings to the barracks roofs as another transport arrives. Among the SS guards supervising the selection stands a woman whose boots will become synonymous with terror. Hermine Braunsteiner, known to prisoners as the Mare for her brutal kicks, moves along the lines with cold efficiency. The Nazi regime expected their concentration camp system to function as an industrial operation, eliminating those deemed undesirable with bureaucratic precision. The reality was far more visceral, a realm of individual cruelty where guards like Braunsteiner transformed policy into personal violence. Over 78,000 souls would perish at Majdanek before Soviet forces arrived, yet Braunsteiner would vanish into post-war chaos, living quietly in Queens, New York, for nearly 2 decades. This is the story of how one woman's crimes finally caught up with her, and how justice, however delayed, persevered. Vienna, 1919, Hermine Braunsteiner was born into a city reeling from the First World War's aftermath. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had collapsed, bread lines stretched around blocks. Her father, a brewery worker, struggled to feed the family. Young Hermine knew poverty intimately, wearing threadbare dresses and sleeping in an unheated apartment. By the early 1930s, Austria teetered on the edge of political chaos. Fascist movements gained strength. Economic depression gripped the nation. For many working-class Austrians like Braunsteiner, National Socialism offered simple answers to complex problems. The ideology provided scapegoats and promised restoration of national pride. In 1938, when Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, Braunsteiner was 19 years old. She worked as a housemaid in Vienna, earning minimal wages. The Nazi Party opened new opportunities for advancement previously unavailable to women of her class. She joined enthusiastically. By 1940, Braunsteiner had enrolled in the SS Auxiliary Service. Her application noted her Aryan heritage and political reliability. The SS accepted her without hesitation. She received assignment to Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp north of Berlin. There she underwent training in the camp guard system. Survivor testimony from Ravensbrück describes the transformation of recruits. Young women arrived uncertain, then gradually internalized the dehumanization of prisoners. Guards learned to view inmates not as human beings, but as numbers, as subhuman threats to racial purity. Braunsteiner adapted quickly to this environment. In October 1942, the SS transferred Braunsteiner to Majdanek, the concentration camp near Lublin, Poland. She was 23 years old. Her new posting would make her infamous. The Nazi regime expected guards to maintain order through fear. Braunsteiner exceeded expectations. Within weeks of arrival, prisoners knew her by reputation. Her brutality became legendary within the camp's wire fences. Majdanek operated differently from the pure extermination camps like Treblinka. Built in autumn 1941, it served multiple purposes: concentration camp, forced labor facility, and killing center. The camp sprawled across 270 acres on Lublin's outskirts. 7 gas chambers operated alongside crematorium furnaces. Barbed wire stretched for miles. The numbers tell the story. Between October 1941 and July 1944, at least 78,000 people died at Majdanek. Some estimates reach higher, to 90,000 or more. The victims included Polish Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish political prisoners, and Roma. Most arrivals faced immediate selection. Those deemed fit for work were sent to barracks, while children, the elderly, and the sick went directly to the gas chambers. Braunsteiner worked in the women's section. Her official title was Aufseherin, female overseer. Her actual role involved supervising prisoner work details, conducting selections, and enforcing discipline through violence. Survivors would later describe her methods in excruciating detail. One account from a Polish-Jewish survivor named Erna Stein described Braunsteiner's arrival at the barracks. She wore riding boots made of heavy leather. When she walked, you could hear them from far away. That sound made everyone freeze with terror. Another survivor, Paula Gerstel, testified, Braunsteiner would kick women with those boots, aiming for their stomachs and kidneys. She smiled while doing it. Some women died from internal bleeding caused by her kicks. The brutality was not random violence, but systematic terror. Guards like Braunsteiner maintained control through unpredictable savagery. Prisoners could not know when punishment would come, only that it would be severe. During the camp's operation, Braunsteiner participated in numerous selections. These processes determined who would live and who would die. Guards walked through barracks, pointing at prisoners. Those selected were marched to the gas chambers. Braunsteiner performed this duty repeatedly, selecting hundreds for execution. The Nazi regime documented everything meticulously. Transport lists recorded arrivals, death certificates noted causes of death, usually falsified, property receipts tracked valuables stolen from victims. This bureaucratic precision would later provide crucial evidence for prosecution. Yet, amid the documentation, the human reality emerges. A survivor named Esther Raab remembered, "Braunsteiner selected my mother during a roll call. I was standing right there. My mother looked at me, but there was nothing either of us could do. I never saw her again." Prisoners gave Braunsteiner a nickname that would follow her through history, the Mare. The name derived from her method of kicking victims with her heavy boots like a horse. The nickname spread through the camp in whispered Polish and Yiddish. To speak it aloud risked death, but everyone knew whom it meant. Testimony from survivors paints a consistent picture. Braunsteiner distinguished herself even among brutal guards through her enthusiasm for violence. While some guards performed their duties with cold professionalism, Braunsteiner appeared to enjoy inflicting pain. One survivor, Maria Amsteg-Paszkowska, recalled in her 1973 testimony, "She would walk through the camp with a whip. If she saw someone who looked weak or moved too slowly, she would beat them until they couldn't stand. Then she would have them dragged to the gas chamber." Another account describes Braunsteiner's role during the camp's most horrific operation. On November 3, 1943, the SS conducted what they called Action Erntefest, Operation Harvest Festival. Over 3 days, they murdered approximately 18,000 Jews at Majdanek and nearby camps. Machine guns fired continuously as prisoners were forced to lie in ditches, then shot. Loudspeakers played music to mask the sounds of killing. Braunsteiner participated in these massacres. She helped organize the prisoners into groups, supervised their march to the killing grounds, and ensured the operation proceeded efficiently. Survivors who witnessed the preparations never forgot her presence. The systematic nature of the violence is crucial to understanding Majdanek. This was not chaos or the fog of war. Guards operated according to clear orders, following established procedures for selection, execution, and body disposal. Braunsteiner functioned within this system, carrying out her assigned role. Yet within the system, individual choices mattered. Guards could choose to minimize suffering or amplify it. Braunsteiner consistently chose cruelty. Survivors noted that she volunteered for the worst duties, sought opportunities to inflict pain, and showed no hesitation in sending women and children to their deaths. One particularly haunting account comes from survivor Esther Licht, who testified, "I saw Braunsteiner grab a child from its mother's arms during a selection. The child was maybe 2 years old. She threw the child onto a truck headed for the gas chamber. When the mother tried to follow, Braunsteiner kicked her unconscious. The mother died from those injuries. The child died in the gas." By July 1944, when Soviet forces approached, the SS began evacuating Majdanek. They attempted to destroy evidence, burning documents, and dismantling gas chambers. Braunsteiner was among those transferred west ahead of the Soviet advance. She would spend the final months of the war at Ravensbrück again, then at a subcamp near Czechoslovakia. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Braunsteiner was 26 years old. She had spent nearly 3 years at Majdanek, participating in the murder of tens of thousands. Now she faced an uncertain future in a world that was just beginning to discover the full scope of Nazi crimes. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich collapsed. Across Europe, millions of displaced persons wandered through rubble. Among them, thousands of Nazi perpetrators attempted to disappear. The post-war chaos created opportunities for escape. Allied forces struggled to process millions of refugees, prisoners of war, and concentration camp survivors. Documentation was sparse or non-existent. Many people had lost all identification during the war. In this confusion, perpetrators could reinvent themselves. Braunsteiner initially remained in Austria, her homeland. She worked various jobs, keeping a low profile. Allied authorities conducted investigations into concentration camp personnel, but the scope of the task proved overwhelming. Millions of Nazi Party members existed. Hundreds of thousands had served in the SS or camp guard system. Investigators focused primarily on high-ranking officials and those whose crimes were immediately documented. Lower-ranking guards like Braunsteiner often escaped initial scrutiny. She had not been photographed extensively. Her name appeared on personnel rosters, but those documents were scattered or destroyed. Without specific accusations from survivors, she remained anonymous among millions. The escape networks operated informally at first. Nazi sympathizers helped former comrades obtain false papers and travel documents. Catholic Church officials, motivated by anti-communism and misplaced mercy, sometimes assisted. The networks became known as rat lines, routes from Germany and Austria to Spain, South America, and the United States. Braunsteiner did not flee immediately. She remained in Austria through the late 1940s, living under her real name, but concealing her wartime activities. If questioned, she claimed to have worked in factories. Nobody checked closely. In 1949, she married an Austrian man named Russell Ryan, an American serviceman stationed in Austria. The marriage provided a crucial opportunity: immigration to the United States. Ryan had no knowledge of his wife's past. She told him she had worked as a nurse during the war. The U.S. immigration process in 1949 remained relatively cursory. Applicants filled out forms declaring their wartime activities. Braunsteiner lied, stating she had never been a member of the Nazi Party or served in any military capacity. Immigration officials, overwhelmed with applications, conducted minimal verification. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 and subsequent legislation allowed hundreds of thousands of Europeans to immigrate to America. The legislation aimed to help genuine refugees and displaced persons rebuild their lives. It also created loopholes. An estimated 10,000 former Nazis entered the United States through these programs, their histories hidden or obscured. In 1959, Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan arrived in New York City. She settled in Queens with her husband. She found work in a factory, then later as a hospital housekeeper. She spoke English with a heavy accent but adapted to American life. She attended church regularly, maintained a modest apartment, and gave no indication of her past. Neighbors knew her as a quiet, somewhat stern woman. She rarely socialized but maintained cordial relations with those nearby. Nobody suspected that the middle-aged housewife had once terrorized prisoners at Majdanek. The successful escape of so many perpetrators would later be called one of the great failures of post-war justice. While the Nuremberg trials prosecuted major war criminals, thousands of direct perpetrators, the people who actually operated the gas chambers, conducted the selections and carried out the beatings, lived freely under assumed identities or through simple concealment. 172nd Street, Queens, New York, 1963, Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan became an American citizen. She stood in a courtroom with dozens of other immigrants, right hand raised, and swore allegiance to the United States. The judge welcomed the new citizens. Braunsteiner smiled. Her past remained hidden. Queens in the 1960s was a neighborhood of immigrants, European refugees mixed with Puerto Rican families and upwardly mobile Americans seeking affordable housing. Braunsteiner blended in perfectly. Her accent marked her as foreign but not unusual. The borough held thousands of German and Austrian immigrants. She worked at a hospital in Manhattan, performing housekeeping duties. Co-workers found her efficient but cold. She rarely engaged in personal conversation. During lunch breaks, while others chatted, she ate alone, reading German-language newspapers available at local shops. At home, Braunsteiner maintained a tidy apartment. Her husband worked in construction. They lived modestly, saving money carefully. To neighbors, they seemed like any other working-class immigrant couple pursuing the American dream. But Braunsteiner carried secrets. She never discussed her life before America in detail. When asked about wartime experiences, she offered vague answers about hardship and survival. She claimed to have worked in factories, fleeing the Soviet advance at war's end. The story was plausible. Millions of Germans and Austrians had similar experiences. During this period, war crimes investigations continued in Europe. The Federal Republic of Germany established the Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes in Ludwigsburg in 1958. The office began systematically documenting crimes and identifying perpetrators. Researchers collected survivor testimonies, examined camp records, and built cases for prosecution. In Israel, the Mossad captured Adolf Eichmann in Argentina in 1960. His trial in Jerusalem in 1961 riveted global attention. Survivors testified, describing the machinery of genocide in meticulous detail. The trial reminded the world that Nazi crimes remained unpunished, that thousands of perpetrators lived freely. Simon Wiesenthal, the famed Nazi hunter, operating from Vienna, maintained extensive files on SS personnel. His organization collected information from survivors, government archives, and tip-offs. The files included names, photographs, and last known locations of suspected war criminals. Among those files, Hermine Braunsteiner. Wiesenthal had received information from Majdanek survivors who remembered the Mare. They provided physical descriptions, details of her crimes, and her maiden name. Wiesenthal's researchers determined she had likely married and possibly emigrated, but her location remained unknown. In Queens, Braunsteiner lived unaware that investigators thousands of miles away were building a case file on her. She went to work, came home, watched television, lived an ordinary life. The contrast between her mundane American existence and her horrific past created a profound dissonance. The same hands that now cleaned hospital floors had once beaten women to death at Majdanek. The question of how perpetrators psychologically manage such transitions fascinates historians. How did someone who committed atrocities transform into a seemingly normal person? Research suggests that many perpetrators compartmentalize their crimes, viewing their wartime actions as a separate chapter disconnected from their present lives. Some expressed no remorse, believing they had simply followed orders in extraordinary circumstances. Braunsteiner apparently fell into this category. Later testimony would indicate she felt no guilt about her actions at Majdanek. She had served Germany, followed orders, and done her duty as she understood it. Her life in America represented not an escape from justice, but simply a new chapter after a war that Germany lost. This period of quiet anonymity would last until 1963, when events set in motion years earlier would finally catch up with her. Vienna, 1963. A clerk in the Austrian passport office processed a routine application. Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan, née Braunsteiner, requested a passport renewal to visit family in Austria. The clerk stamped the application, noting her address: Queens, New York, United States. This seemingly mundane bureaucratic action changed everything. Austrian authorities routinely shared such information with West German investigators. The passport application reached the central office in Ludwigsburg. A researcher cross-referenced the name against wanted persons lists. The match came immediately. Hermine Braunsteiner, former SS guard at Majdanek concentration camp. Multiple survivor testimonies documented her crimes. Arrest warrant issued. Last known location, unknown, until now. The information traveled to Simon Wiesenthal's Vienna office. Wiesenthal recognized the significance immediately. Braunsteiner represented a rare opportunity, a documented perpetrator whose location was now confirmed. Most war criminals had vanished completely. This one had effectively identified herself through a routine passport application. Wiesenthal contacted his network in the United States. He reached out to journalist colleagues, knowing that public exposure often proved more effective than slow diplomatic processes. One contact was Joseph Werschber, a producer for CBS News. Another was Howard Blum, a reporter for the New York Times. In October 1964, the New York Times published an article titled "Nazi War Criminal Living in Queens." The article identified Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan by name and address. It described her role at Majdanek, quoted survivor testimony, and revealed she had become a U.S. citizen through fraudulent claims on her immigration application. The revelation shocked New York's Jewish community. Queens held a substantial population of Holocaust survivors. Many had lost family members at Majdanek specifically. Now they learned that one of the camp's most brutal guards lived among them, had walked the same streets, shopped at the same stores. Reaction came swiftly. Survivors organized protests outside Braunsteiner's apartment building. Reporters camped on the street. Television cameras captured Braunsteiner attempting to leave for work, shielding her face from cameras. Her life of anonymity ended instantly. Braunsteiner initially denied everything. She told reporters the accusations were false, cases of mistaken identity. She claimed she had never been at Majdanek, never served in the SS. Her husband, learning of the allegations for the first time, appeared stunned and confused, but the evidence proved overwhelming. Survivor testimony was consistent and detailed. SS personnel records, recovered from German archives, listed her name and assignment. Photographs from the war years, though few, matched her appearance. The case against her was solid. The U.S. Department of Justice faced a complex legal situation. Braunsteiner had obtained citizenship through fraud, lying about her Nazi Party membership and SS service on immigration forms. This provided grounds for denaturalization, stripping her of citizenship. However, war crimes committed in Europe fell outside U.S. criminal jurisdiction. Prosecution would require extradition to West Germany. In December 1964, the Immigration and Naturalization Service initiated denaturalization proceedings. The government filed a complaint in U.S. District Court, arguing that Braunsteiner had procured citizenship illegally and should have it revoked. The case moved slowly through the legal system. Braunsteiner hired attorneys who argued that too much time had passed, that witnesses might be unreliable, that she deserved the presumption of innocence. The defense tactics aimed to delay and complicate the proceedings. Meanwhile, West German authorities formally requested Braunsteiner's extradition. They charged her with murder and complicity in mass murder at Majdanek. Under German law, these crimes carried no statute of limitations. The legal battles would continue for years. But the discovery itself, the breakthrough that located Braunsteiner after 2 decades of anonymity, demonstrated that even time and distance could not guarantee escape. Patient investigation, survivor testimony, and international cooperation had finally caught up with the mayor of Majdanek. The strength of the case against Braunsteiner rested on survivor testimony. Between 1965 and 1973, prosecutors in both the United States and West Germany collected statements from dozens of Majdanek survivors who remembered her specifically. These testimonies shared remarkable consistency. Survivors, interviewed separately across different countries, described the same person with the same methods. They remembered her heavy boots, her whip, her selections, her kicks. Many knew her by the nickname the Mare. Their accounts corroborated each other in precise detail. Esther Licht provided particularly damning testimony. She testified in a U.S. courtroom in 1968. I remember her clearly. She wore riding boots and carried a whip. She would walk through our barracks during roll call. If someone looked sick or weak, she would pull them from the line. Those women went to the gas chamber. I saw her do this dozens of times, Licht continued. Once, during a selection, my sister stood beside me. We looked similar, both young, both relatively healthy. Braunsteiner walked past me, then stopped. She looked at my sister. Then she grabbed her arm and dragged her to the group selected for death. There was no reason. My sister was strong enough to work, but Braunsteiner decided she would die. That was October 1943. I never saw my sister again. Another survivor, Henrika Ostrowska, testified about Braunsteiner's participation in punishments. She would beat women for the smallest infractions, walking too slowly, looking at a guard, having dirty clothing. But the beatings weren't disciplinary. She enjoyed it. You could see it in her face. She would kick women in the stomach with those boots until they couldn't breathe. Some died from internal bleeding. The testimonies also documented Braunsteiner's role in the November 1943 massacre. Multiple survivors described seeing her organize groups of prisoners for the mass shootings, supervise their march to the killing grounds, and ensure the operation proceeded efficiently. Rachel Nussbaum testified, during the Erntefest action, Braunsteiner was everywhere. She helped separate people into groups. She pushed them forward when they hesitated. She watched the shootings to make sure everything went according to plan. She showed no emotion at all. It was like watching someone organize a factory shift. The prosecution faced challenges. Typical of war crimes cases. 20 years had passed since the events. Memories could fade or become confused. Defense attorneys argued that survivors might be mistaken, that trauma could distort recollection, that one guard might be confused with another, but the sheer volume and consistency of testimony overcame these arguments. Survivor after survivor, interviewed independently, provided matching descriptions. They remembered specific incidents, specific dates, specific details that corresponded with documented facts about Majdanek's operation. Moreover, some survivors had written accounts immediately after liberation in 1944. These contemporaneous documents, preserved in archives, included references to the brutal female guard with riding boots. The nickname the Mare appeared in Polish and Yiddish testimonies from the immediate post-war period, before anyone knew Braunsteiner's location or that she would ever face trial. The testimonies served another crucial function beyond providing evidence. They ensured that victims' experiences entered the historical record. For many survivors, testifying represented the only opportunity to hold perpetrators accountable. Their words preserved memory, honored the dead, and insisted on acknowledgement of what had occurred. During her testimony, survivor Sarah Lewin stated, "For 20 years, I lived with nightmares of Majdanek. I saw her face every night, that cold, cruel face. When I learned she was alive and living freely in America, I was angry, but not surprised. I knew many Nazis had escaped, but knowing she would finally face justice, finally answer for what she did, this gave me strength. Not peace, but strength." The testimonies filled thousands of pages of court transcripts. They described a system of industrialized murder operated by individuals who made daily choices to inflict suffering. Braunsteiner was one of thousands who participated, but the documented evidence against her was particularly strong. Her victims had survived, remembered, and now spoke. U.S. District Court, Eastern District of New York, March 1970. Judge Jacob Mishler presided over the denaturalization proceedings against Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan. The courtroom filled with survivors, journalists, and legal observers. This case would set precedents for how the United States handled Nazi war criminals who had entered the country fraudulently. The government's case was straightforward. Braunsteiner had lied on her immigration and naturalization applications. She had falsely claimed never to have been a Nazi party member or served in any military or paramilitary organization. These lies constituted fraud, invalidating her citizenship. Braunsteiner's defense team, led by attorney John Lawrence, argued several points. First, they claimed the proceedings violated due process because they occurred 25 years after the alleged crimes. Second, they questioned the reliability of survivor testimony, suggesting that memories had faded and witnesses might be confused. Third, they argued that Braunsteiner, as a low-ranking guard, had simply followed orders and committed no prosecutable crimes. The trial featured testimony from multiple survivors who identified Braunsteiner and described her actions. The prosecution presented SS personnel records definitively proving her service at Majdanek. They introduced her fraudulent immigration documents. The evidence was overwhelming. Judge Mishler issued his ruling on November 19, 1971. He found that Braunsteiner had indeed procured citizenship through willful misrepresentation. He revoked her citizenship, making her once again an Austrian national subject to deportation. Braunsteiner appealed. Her attorneys argued before the Second Circuit Court of Appeals that the trial had been unfair, that political pressure had influenced the verdict, that survivor testimony was unreliable. The appellate court disagreed, upholding the denaturalization in June 1972. Simultaneously, West Germany formally requested extradition. German prosecutors charged Braunsteiner with murder in connection with selections and beatings at Majdanek. Under the U.S.-German extradition treaty, the request required judicial review. The extradition hearing took place in U.S. District Court in 1973. The German government presented evidence, survivor testimony, SS records, and documentation of Majdanek's operation. They argued that Braunsteiner's crimes clearly met the treaty's requirements. Murder charges supported by substantial evidence. Braunsteiner's defense opposed extradition on multiple grounds. They argued that the alleged crimes occurred too long ago for fair prosecution. They claimed that political considerations in Germany might prevent a fair trial. They suggested that Braunsteiner, as a woman following orders in wartime, should not be held criminally responsible for actions taken under duress. The prosecution countered each argument. They noted that West Germany's judicial system met all standards of due process. They emphasized that Nazi crimes had no statute of limitations under German law precisely because of their extraordinary nature. They presented evidence that Braunsteiner had volunteered for camp service and exceeded requirements in her brutality. On August 7, 1973, Judge Mischler approved the extradition request. He found that sufficient evidence supported the murder charges and that Germany provided adequate guarantees of due process. Braunsteiner had exhausted her appeals in the denaturalization case. Now she faced deportation to stand trial in Germany. The legal proceedings consumed nearly a decade, from initial discovery in 1964 to final extradition approval in 1973. This lengthy process reflected several factors: the complexity of war crimes prosecution, the novel legal questions about denaturalization and extradition, and Braunsteiner's determined efforts to resist through every available legal avenue. The case established important precedents. It demonstrated that citizenship obtained through fraud could be revoked even decades later. It showed that war crimes committed abroad could be addressed through extradition when domestic prosecution was impossible. It proved that survivor testimony, properly corroborated, could meet legal standards of evidence even after many years. For survivors watching the proceedings, the delays proved frustrating. Justice delayed felt like justice threatened. Many feared Braunsteiner would find some legal technicality to avoid prosecution. But they also recognized that careful adherence to legal procedures was essential, both to ensure conviction and to demonstrate that democratic legal systems could address these crimes properly. The U.S. government's handling of the case would influence how it approached other Nazi war criminals discovered living in America. The success of the denaturalization process led to the creation, in 1979, of the Office of Special Investigations within the Department of Justice. This dedicated unit would pursue hundreds of cases against Nazi perpetrators who had fraudulently entered the United States. In August 1973, Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan was taken into custody and deported to West Germany. Her nearly 3 decades in America ended as federal marshals escorted her onto a flight to Frankfurt. The legal battles were over. The criminal trial was about to begin. Düsseldorf District Court, West Germany, November 26, 1975. The Majdanek trial opened. It would become the longest Nazi war crimes trial in German history, lasting nearly 6 years. Braunsteiner faced charges alongside 15 former Majdanek personnel, including guards, administrators, and camp doctors. The indictment charged her with murder, complicity in murder, and crimes against humanity. Prosecutors alleged she had personally participated in killing prisoners and had assisted in the mass murder operations at the camp. The trial's scale was unprecedented. Prosecutors called over 300 witnesses, mostly survivors from Poland, Israel, and North America. The court examined thousands of documents: SS personnel files, camp records, transport lists, and death certificates. Forensic experts testified about the camp's gas chambers and crematoriums. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy with history. Survivors sat facing the defendants, many seeing for the first time since 1944 the people who had tormented them. Braunsteiner sat impassively, occasionally conferring with her court-appointed attorney, showing little emotion as witnesses described her actions. Esther Licht testified again, now before a German court. She pointed at Braunsteiner. "That is the woman who murdered my sister. I watched her select my sister for death. There is no doubt. I remember her face. I have seen it in my nightmares for 30 years. Henryka Ostrawska described the beatings. She would kick women with her boots, aiming for the stomach and kidneys. I saw her kill at least 3 women this way. They died from internal bleeding. She seemed to enjoy it. Her face would show pleasure when she caused pain." The testimony continued week after week, month after month. Survivors described the camp's routine: morning roll calls lasting hours in freezing weather, starvation rations, brutal forced labor, arbitrary executions. They explained the selection process, how guards would walk through barracks and point at women who would be gassed that day. They recounted the November 1943 massacre, when machine guns fired continuously for 3 days. Braunsteiner's defense strategy focused on mitigation rather than denial. Her attorney did not dispute that she had served at Majdanek or that she had participated in camp operations. Instead, he argued that she had merely followed orders, that refusing would have endangered her own life, that she held no decision-making authority. The defense called witnesses who testified about the coercive environment within the SS system. They presented evidence that guards who refused orders could face punishment or transfer to dangerous frontline duty. They argued that Braunsteiner, as a young woman in a totalitarian system, had limited agency. The prosecution systematically demolished these arguments. They presented evidence that Braunsteiner had volunteered for camp service, not been conscripted. They showed that other guards had requested transfers from Majdanek and received them without punishment. They documented that Braunsteiner had exceeded her duties, volunteering for selections and demonstrating enthusiasm for violence that went beyond orders. Crucially, prosecutors emphasized that following orders did not constitute a defense for murder. The Nuremberg principles, established after World War II, explicitly rejected superior orders as justification for crimes against humanity. International law recognized that individuals bore responsibility for their actions, regardless of orders received. The trial proceedings were meticulous. Judge Wilhelm Baer ensured that every piece of evidence was properly examined. The defendants received full due process rights, that survivor testimony was carefully evaluated. The length of the trial reflected this thoroughness. German courts were determined to demonstrate that Nazi crimes would be prosecuted with scrupulous adherence to legal standards. For survivors, the trial provided both vindication and frustration. They appreciated finally being heard, seeing perpetrators face justice. But the clinical legal language, the defense arguments, the procedural delays, all of this could feel inadequate to the magnitude of suffering they had endured. Rachel Nussbaum expressed this tension during her testimony. How do I explain what Majdanek was? How do I make the court understand? The cold, the hunger, the terror, watching children thrown into trucks headed for the gas chambers, seeing women beaten to death. How do I convey this in legal language? But I must try. Because if we don't speak, if we don't testify, then they win. They get to live freely while our families are dead. The trial also confronted German society with uncomfortable truths. The proceedings received extensive media coverage. Germans watched television reports showing concentration camp survivors describing atrocities committed by ordinary Germans. The trial forced acknowledgement that the Holocaust involved not just Nazi leaders, but thousands of individual perpetrators who made daily choices to participate in genocide. After more than 5 years of testimony and deliberation, the court prepared to issue verdicts. The trial had consumed enormous resources, examined mountains of evidence, and heard from hundreds of witnesses. Now judgment would finally come. June 30th, 1981. Judge Baer read the verdicts. The courtroom was silent, except for his voice. After nearly 6 years of trial, resolution had arrived. Of the 16 defendants, 14 were convicted on various charges. 2 were acquitted due to insufficient evidence linking them to specific crimes. Sentences ranged from 3 years to life imprisonment. Hermine Braunsteiner was convicted on multiple counts. The court found her guilty of murder in connection with the selection of prisoners for gas chambers. The judgment noted that she had personally selected at least 100 women and children for execution. Complicity in murder for her participation in camp operations that resulted in deaths. Accessory to murder for assisting in the November 1943 massacre, where she had helped organize prisoners for execution. The court sentenced Braunsteiner to life imprisonment, the maximum penalty under German law. Judge Baer's written judgment provided detailed reasoning. It noted that while Braunsteiner had indeed followed orders, she had done so with extraordinary cruelty that exceeded requirements. She had volunteered for the worst duties, shown enthusiasm for violence, and demonstrated no remorse. The judgment explicitly rejected the defense argument about following orders. The defendant had choices, other guards requested transfers, some performed their duties with minimal violence. The defendant chose to maximize suffering. She volunteered to participate in selections, she beat prisoners beyond any order received. These were individual choices for which she bears full criminal responsibility. Regarding the long delay between crimes and prosecution, the court acknowledged the passage of time but emphasized the magnitude of these crimes admits no statute of limitations. That the defendant evaded justice for decades through fraud does not diminish her culpability. The victims' families have waited, 37 years for accountability. Justice delayed is not justice forfeited. Survivors in the courtroom reacted with mixed emotions. Some wept, finally seeing acknowledgement of their suffering. Others felt the sentence inadequate. How could any punishment match the scale of crimes committed? Several expressed frustration that Braunsteiner would spend her remaining years in prison with adequate food, medical care, and dignity that she had denied her victims. Esther Licht, whose sister Braunsteiner had murdered, stated after the verdict, "Life in prison, she took thousands of lives. My sister was 20 years old, she would be 57 now. She might have had children, grandchildren. All of that was stolen. How do you balance that? You can't. But at least this verdict says what happened. It says her crimes were real. It says the law recognizes murder even decades later." The conviction represented only the second time a female concentration camp guard had been prosecuted in Germany. The first was the Auschwitz guard Hermine Braunsteiner, coincidentally sharing the same first name, convicted in 1946. The paucity of prosecutions against female perpetrators reflected broader gaps in post-war justice. Most investigations focused on male SS officers and camp commandants. Female guards, who constituted a significant portion of personnel at women's camps, often escaped prosecution. The Düsseldorf trial also convicted several other Majdanek personnel. The camp commandant received life imprisonment. Several guards received sentences ranging from 3 to 12 years. A camp doctor who had participated in selections received 4 years. These sentences troubled many observers. How could guards who participated in mass murder receive single-digit sentences? The disparities reflected German criminal law's distinctions between direct perpetrators and accomplices. Those who gave orders or made decisions received harsher sentences than those who merely carried out orders. The legal framework struggled to capture the collective nature of genocide, where thousands of individual actions combined to produce mass death. The trial's conclusion marked not an ending, but a beginning of different struggles. Braunsteiner would appeal, delaying her imprisonment. German courts would continue processing Majdanek cases, trying other personnel. Survivors would continue their efforts to ensure remembrance and education about the Holocaust. For Hermine Braunsteiner, the verdict ended her decades of freedom. At 62 years old, she faced spending her remaining life in prison. She had lived 26 years in Queens, living an ordinary life while her crimes remained hidden. Those years of normalcy were over. The conviction also validated the efforts of Simon Wiesenthal, the journalists who exposed her, the prosecutors who built the case, and most importantly, the survivors who testified. Their persistence had overcome bureaucratic obstacles, legal technicalities, and the passage of time. Justice, however imperfect and delayed, had been achieved. The verdict received international coverage. In the United States, newspapers reported on the trial's conclusion, noting Braunsteiner's years in Queens. In Israel, Holocaust survivors' organizations praised the conviction. In Poland, where Majdanek still stood as a memorial and museum, the verdict was seen as acknowledgement of crimes committed on Polish soil against Polish citizens and Polish Jews. The Düsseldorf trial remains the longest Nazi war crimes proceeding in German legal history. Its thoroughness demonstrated Germany's commitment to confronting its past. Its verdicts provided some measure of accountability. But as survivors noted, no trial could truly balance the scales. The dead remained dead. The suffering remained real. The trial provided legal judgment, but not healing, not restoration, not return of what was lost. Lübeck-Lauerhof Prison, West Germany, June 1981. Hermine Braunsteiner entered prison to begin her life sentence. She was 62 years old. She would spend the next 18 years incarcerated. German prisons emphasized rehabilitation over pure punishment. Braunsteiner received a private cell with basic furnishings. She had access to medical care, adequate food, and opportunities for work within the prison. The conditions contrasted starkly with the deprivation she had inflicted at Majdanek, where prisoners slept on wooden bunks without bedding, received starvation rations, and had no medical treatment. Braunsteiner never expressed remorse. In interviews with prison psychologists recorded in her prison file, she maintained that she had simply done her duty in wartime. She claimed not to remember specific incidents described by survivors. When confronted with the trial verdict, she insisted the testimony against her had been exaggerated or mistaken. This lack of remorse frustrated survivors and historians alike. Research into perpetrator psychology shows this pattern is common. Many who committed atrocities during the Holocaust maintained lifelong conviction that their actions were justified or that they bore no personal responsibility. They internalized the Nazi ideology so completely that even decades later, even after conviction, they could not acknowledge the fundamental criminality of their actions. Braunsteiner's health declined in prison. She developed heart problems and diabetes. By the early 1990s, she required regular medical treatment. German law allowed for compassionate release of terminally ill prisoners, but prosecutors opposed such release in Braunsteiner's case, citing the severity of her crimes and lack of remorse. In April 1999, at age 79, Hermine Braunsteiner died in prison from heart failure. She had served 18 years of her life sentence. Her death received minimal media coverage, a brief obituary noting her conviction, but little more. She was cremated, her ashes scattered according to German regulations. The question of her legacy remained complex. In one sense, her prosecution represented a victory for justice. She had been found, tried, convicted, and imprisoned. The system, however, slowly had worked. Survivors had been heard, the historical record documented her crimes, future generations could learn about Majdanek and understand individual responsibility for genocide. Yet her case also illuminated failures. She had lived freely for 34 years after the war, longer than she spent in the SS. She had obtained U.S. citizenship through fraud and maintained that citizenship for 12 years before discovery. Hundreds of other perpetrators were never found at all. The gaps in post-war justice were as significant as the successes. The Düsseldorf trials records, over 30,000 pages, reside in German archives. They constitute one of the most complete documentations of concentration camp operations and individual perpetrator responsibility. Historians use these records to understand how the Holocaust functioned at ground level, not just as policy decided by Nazi leaders, but as daily practice implemented by guards, administrators, and camp personnel. Majdanek itself became a state museum in 1944, shortly after Soviet liberation. Unlike Auschwitz, where the Nazis had time to destroy much evidence, Majdanek remained largely intact. The gas chambers, barracks, crematoriums, and watchtowers still stand. Over 200,000 people visit annually, walking through the spaces where Braunsteiner and others committed their crimes. The museum maintains an archive of survivor testimony, including many statements about Braunsteiner. Educational programs use her case to teach about individual responsibility. Guides explain that the Holocaust required thousands of people making daily choices to participate. Braunsteiner exemplified this. Not a high-ranking official making policy, but a guard implementing that policy through personal violence. Her story also illustrates the long arc of accountability, from her crimes in 1942 through her discovery in 1964, to her trial beginning 1975, to her conviction in 1981, to her death in 1999, 5 decades during which justice slowly pursued her. This extended timeline demonstrates both the persistence required for accountability and the challenges of retrospective prosecution. For survivors, Braunsteiner's death brought no closure. How could it? Their families remained dead. Their suffering remained real. The fact that one perpetrator had been punished did not restore what was lost. But it mattered nonetheless. It proved that memory endures, that testimony can prevail, that even decades later, justice remains possible. The legal precedents established by her case influenced subsequent prosecutions. The denaturalization process used against her became a model for pursuing Nazi war criminals who had fraudulently entered Western countries. The extradition procedures tested in her case guided later cases. The trial's thoroughness set standards for how German courts handled Nazi crimes. Hermine Braunsteiner's name remains associated with Majdanek. Historical texts documenting the camp mention her specifically. Memorial sites reference her crimes. Educational materials use her case to illustrate how ordinary people participated in genocide. Her attempted anonymity failed. Her crimes were documented. Her conviction stands in the historical record. The question posed by her life, how someone could inflict such cruelty, then live decades as an apparently normal person, remains disturbing. It challenges comfortable assumptions about evil being obvious or perpetrators being monsters easily distinguished from ordinary people. Braunsteiner worked in a factory and a hospital. She had neighbors and co-workers who found her ordinary, yet she had beaten women to death, selected children for gas chambers, participated in mass murder. This duality, perpetrator and ordinary person, is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of her legacy. It reminds us that genocide requires not exceptional monsters, but ordinary people willing to commit extraordinary crimes. Understanding this is essential to preventing future atrocities. Washington, D.C., 1979. The U.S. Department of Justice established the Office of Special Investigations, the OSI, dedicated to identifying and prosecuting Nazi war criminals who had entered the United States illegally. The Braunsteiner case had revealed systemic failures in immigration screening, The OSI would attempt to correct those failures retroactively. The office began with files on approximately 70 suspected war criminals living in America. That number would grow to thousands as researchers examined immigration records, survivor testimonies, and Eastern European archives. The OSI discovered that an estimated 10,000 former Nazis and collaborators had entered the United States after World War II, most through fraud. The cases followed patterns similar to Braunsteiner's. Perpetrators had lied on immigration forms, concealing their Nazi Party membership or service in military and paramilitary units. They had built new lives in America, working regular jobs, raising families, becoming citizens. Their pasts remained hidden until survivor testimony or archival research exposed them. Between 1979 and 2010, when it was absorbed into a larger division, the OSI handled over 1,000 investigations. It achieved denaturalization and deportation in over 100 cases. Others died before prosecution could proceed. Many cases proved impossible to prosecute due to insufficient evidence or witnesses who had died. The office faced enormous challenges. Memories faded with time. Witnesses aged and died. Documents were incomplete or destroyed. Defense attorneys argued that prosecuting crimes 50 years old violated fundamental fairness. Each case required painstaking research in multiple countries' archives. Alan Ryan, who directed the OSI from 1980 to 1983, later wrote, "The Braunsteiner case showed us both the possibilities and limitations of retrospective justice. We could identify perpetrators and strip citizenship obtained through fraud, but we couldn't prosecute criminally, only denaturalize and deport. The actual trials had to occur in European countries. This created coordination challenges and meant justice depended on foreign governments' willingness to prosecute. Notable OSI cases included John Demjanjuk, accused of serving as a guard at Treblinka and later at Sobibor. His case involved multiple extraditions, trials, and appeals over 3 decades. He was eventually convicted in Germany in 2011 at age 91. Another case involved Valerian Trifa, a Romanian archbishop living in Detroit who had participated in anti-Jewish pogroms. The OSI denaturalized him in 1982. He fled to Portugal, where he died in 1987. Each case required proving that the individual had lied on immigration forms and had participated in persecution. The evidentiary standards were high. The OSI had to demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that the person before the court was the same person who committed crimes decades earlier. This required documentation like SS personnel files, photographs, fingerprints, and consistent survivor testimony. The work took psychological tolls on investigators. Reading thousands of pages of testimony describing atrocities, examining photographs of mass graves, interviewing survivors, this exposure to humanity's darkest chapters affected those who pursued justice. Several OSI attorneys later wrote about the difficulty of maintaining professional distance while handling these cases. For survivors, the OSI's existence represented acknowledgement. The U.S. government admitted that war criminals had entered the country and committed to addressing this failure. When survivors learned that someone who had tortured them lived in America, they could now report this to an office dedicated to investigation. The OSI also influenced how other countries approached retrospective justice. Canada established a similar unit. Australia investigated suspected war criminals within its borders. European countries expanded their own investigations. The message was clear: time did not grant immunity. Crimes against humanity remained prosecutable regardless of how many decades passed. Critics argued that prosecuting elderly defendants for crimes committed in wartime half a century earlier served little purpose. They suggested that resources would be better spent on preventing current atrocities. They questioned the fairness of trials, where memories might be unreliable and many witnesses had died. Supporters countered that accountability matters regardless of time elapsed. The principle that genocide cannot be hidden behind time and distance needed affirmation. Survivors deserved acknowledgement. Historical truth required documentation through legal proceedings. Future potential perpetrators needed to understand that eventually, somehow, justice might find them. The practical reality was that most perpetrators escaped any accountability. Of the hundreds of thousands who participated in the Holocaust, guards, administrators, police, collaborators, only a small fraction faced prosecution. The vast majority lived out their lives unpunished. This reality frustrates historians and survivors, representing a profound failure of post-war justice systems. Yet, the cases that were prosecuted, including Braunsteiner's, mattered. They established legal principles, they documented crimes, they provided survivors with opportunities to testify. They demonstrated that democratic societies could confront historical atrocities through legal mechanisms. They served educational purposes, ensuring that details of the Holocaust entered public consciousness and legal records. The OSI's work continues in modified form through the Department of Justice's Human Rights and Special Prosecutions section. The focus has shifted from World War II perpetrators to more recent war criminals and human rights violators. But the principles established through Nazi prosecutions guide this work. Immigration fraud can be prosecuted decades later, survivor testimony is valuable evidence, and no safe haven exists for those who committed crimes against humanity. Lublin, Poland, present day. Majdanek State Museum occupies the grounds where the concentration camp operated. Unlike most Nazi camps, which were dismantled or destroyed, Majdanek remains largely intact. Visitors can walk through original barracks, see the gas chambers and crematoriums, stand at the watchtowers. The preservation creates a visceral connection to history impossible to achieve through photographs or descriptions alone. Over 200,000 people visit Majdanek annually. They come from across the world, school groups, families, Holocaust survivors, and their descendants, historians, and individuals seeking to understand this chapter of history. The museum offers tours in multiple languages, maintains extensive archives, and provides educational programming. The site includes several monuments. The most striking is a large mausoleum holding ashes of victims exhumed from campgrounds. The structure, built in 1969, resembles both a tombstone and a protective shelter. Inside, behind glass, tons of human ash represent lives reduced to dust. Visitors approach in silence, many weeping. The museum's educational mission emphasizes individual stories within the massive death toll. Exhibits include photographs of victims, preserved personal belongings, excerpts from letters and diaries. The goal is to prevent numbers from becoming abstractions. 78,000 deaths represent 78,000 individuals, each with names, families, hopes, and futures that were stolen. Braunsteiner's case features in educational materials. Tour guides describe how camp personnel lived ordinary post-war lives. The lesson is about responsibility, that genocide requires thousands of individual actors making daily choices. Guards could choose to minimize suffering or amplify it. Most chose the latter. Understanding this is essential to preventing future atrocities. The broader question of Holocaust memory remains urgent. As survivors age and die, direct testimony disappears. Within the next decade, virtually no survivors will remain alive. This transition creates new challenges for education and memory. How do societies preserve truth about the Holocaust when those who experienced it directly can no longer speak? Documentation becomes crucial. Trial transcripts, like those from the Düsseldorf trial, preserve survivor testimony in legal records. These thousands of pages of testimony will outlast the survivors themselves. Researchers can study detailed accounts of camp operations, individual perpetrator actions, and victim experiences. The trials created permanent historical documentation. Memorial sites serve similar functions. Majdanek's preservation ensures that future generations can see where these crimes occurred. The physicality matters. Walking through the spaces, seeing the gas chambers, understanding the scale. This experience communicates in ways that books and films cannot. Educational programs in schools worldwide teach Holocaust history. Curricula include survivor testimony, historical documentation, and analysis of how genocide developed. The goal is both remembrance and prevention, honoring victims while ensuring students understand the warning signs of hatred, dehumanization, and authoritarian violence. But education faces challenges. Holocaust denial persists despite overwhelming evidence. Anti-Semitism endures, sometimes incorporating Holocaust distortion. Far-right movements in various countries minimize Nazi crimes or promote similar hatreds. Combating these requires ongoing efforts to preserve truth and teach accurately. The legal legacy of Nazi prosecutions influences contemporary international law. The principles established at Nuremberg, that individuals bear responsibility for crimes against humanity, that following orders is not a defense, that genocide merits prosecution regardless of time past, guide modern war crimes tribunals, courts addressing atrocities in the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Cambodia, and elsewhere built on these foundations. The International Criminal Court, established in 2002, prosecutes genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Its existence reflects the conviction that such crimes merit international jurisdiction. While the ICC faces political obstacles and enforcement challenges, Its creation represents commitment to accountability that emerged from World War II's aftermath. For Holocaust survivors and their descendants, the pursuit of justice remains personal. Organizations like the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany continue seeking compensation for survivors. Museums and memorials honor victims. Educational initiatives combat hatred and ignorance. These efforts constitute ongoing resistance against forgetting. Survivors who testified against Braunsteiner and others often described their testimony as obligation. They felt duty to those who died, responsibility to ensure the truth was documented, commitment to warning future generations. Many found testifying traumatic, reliving experiences they had tried to bury, facing perpetrators again, describing in courtrooms what they had endured. They did it anyway. Esther Licht, who testified at both the U.S. denaturalization hearing and the Dusseldorf trial, stated in a later interview, "I wanted to forget. For years after the war, I tried not to think about Majdanek. I built a new life, married, had children. But forgetting was impossible. The memories haunted me. When I learned Braunsteiner was alive and would face trial, I knew I had to testify. Not for revenge. She could never bring back my sister, but for truth. So the world would know what happened. So my sister's death would be documented so future generations would understand." This commitment to testimony, to truth-telling despite trauma, represents one of the most profound aspects of Holocaust remembrance. Survivors transformed their suffering into historical documentation. They ensured that perpetrators faced accountability. They taught subsequent generations. Their voices, preserved in testimony and legal records, will continue educating long after they are gone. The case of Hermine Braunsteiner illuminates multiple dimensions of Holocaust memory and justice. Her crimes exemplify how ordinary individuals participated in genocide. Her escape demonstrates how perpetrators evaded accountability. Her discovery shows the persistence of investigation and survivor testimony. Her trial proves that legal mechanisms can address historical atrocities. Her conviction affirms that no amount of time grants immunity from responsibility. The story does not end with her death or conviction. It continues in the educational programs at Majdanek, in the OSI's ongoing work, in classrooms worldwide where teachers explain the Holocaust, in memorials and museums, in the legal precedents that guide international justice. Braunsteiner wanted to disappear into anonymity. Instead, her crimes became documented history, her trial a case study, her name linked forever to the atrocities she committed. This is the final victory of accountability over impunity, of memory over forgetting. The 78,000 who died at Majdanek cannot be restored. The suffering inflicted cannot be undone, but their stories are preserved. The truth is documented. The perpetrators are named. Justice, however imperfect and delayed, was achieved. The lessons resonate beyond the Holocaust. Genocides continue in the modern world. In Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, Myanmar, each demonstrates that hatred, when allowed to flourish, produces mass atrocity. Each shows that perpetrators believe they will escape accountability. Each proves that without active resistance, evil prevails. The Holocaust's legacy includes both warning and obligation. Warning that civilization is fragile, that democratic norms can collapse, that ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil. Obligation to remember, to educate, to resist hatred, to hold perpetrators accountable, to honor victims, to ensure that never again becomes reality rather than empty slogan. Hermine Braunsteiner's unflinching face behind Majdanek's terror became ultimately the face of accountability delayed but not denied. Her story reminds us that individual actions matter, that responsibility cannot be evaded forever, that survivors' voices carry power, that justice, even decades late, serves truth. The mayor of Majdanek thought she had escaped history. Instead, she became a lesson history continues teaching. The pursuit of Hermine Braunsteiner from the barracks of Majdanek to a courtroom in Queens to a prison cell in Germany spanned 4 decades. Her trial demonstrated that legal systems, however imperfect, can address historical crimes. Survivor testimony proved essential. Their memories, preserved through decades, provided the evidence that conviction required. The story holds enduring relevance. It teaches that perpetrators of mass atrocity should not assume time will grant immunity. It shows that survivors' commitment to truth-telling can overcome bureaucratic obstacles and legal technicalities. It proves that justice, even when significantly delayed, matters for historical truth and moral accountability. Majdanek stands as physical testimony to crimes committed there. The legal records from Braunsteiner's trial stand as documentary testimony. Together they ensure memory persists, that truth cannot be erased, that victims are honored, that perpetrators are named. This is the foundation upon which we build defenses against future atrocities.